Imagine this moment. It's May 1940. France is collapsing. The British Army is trapped on a beach at Dunkirk, waiting to be slaughtered or captured. Nazi Germany controls nearly all of Western Europe, and in a smoke-filled room in London, Winston Churchill faces an impossible choice. Accept peace with Hitler and save the British Empire, or fight on alone, knowing that Britain might be destroyed within weeks. Most of his own cabinet wants him to negotiate. His military advisors tell him the war is already lost. Even his closest allies are whispering that resistance is suicide. But Churchill refuses. He chooses to fight when every rational calculation says Britain should surrender. This decision changed everything. It changed the course of World War II. It changed the fate of democracy itself. But here's what most people don't know. The peace offer was real, the terms were on the table. And for several terrifying days in May 1940, Britain came within a hair's breadth of making a deal with the devil. Today, we're going to explore the most dangerous moment in modern history. We'll uncover what Hitler actually offered Britain. We'll reveal the secret debates inside Churchill's war cabinet, and we'll discover why one man's refusal to surrender became the hinge on which the entire war turned. This is the story of Britain's darkest hour and the choice that saved the world. To understand Churchill's decision, you need to understand just how desperate things were in the spring of 1940. 6 months earlier, Britain and France had declared war on Germany after Hitler invaded Poland. But nothing happened. No major battles. No dramatic offensives. The French sat behind their supposedly impregnable Maginot Line. The British sent a small army to France and waited. Journalists started calling it the phony war. Then, on May 10, 1940, everything exploded. German forces smashed through the Ardennes forest, a route the French had considered impassable for tanks. Within days, they'd broken through French lines and were racing toward the English Channel. The French army, considered one of the finest in the world, was cut in half. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped. The speed was terrifying. In just 2 weeks, Germany accomplished what it couldn't do in 4 years during World War I. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was the collapse of the entire Western Allied strategy. By late May, over 300,000 British and French soldiers were pinned against the sea at Dunkirk. German tanks were miles away. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies. Britain was about to lose its entire professional army. And May 10th was significant for another reason. That was the day Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. He inherited a catastrophe. Not a war that might be won or lost, a war that appeared already over. Now here's where things get interesting. Because at this exact moment of maximum crisis, there was a genuine opportunity for peace. Hitler didn't want to fight Britain. That might sound strange, but it's true. From a strategic standpoint, Germany's real enemy was the Soviet Union. Hitler's long-term vision always involved expanding eastward into Russia. Britain was a distraction. Throughout the 1930s, there had been influential voices in Britain arguing for accommodation with Germany. Some genuinely believed Hitler's ambitions were limited to uniting German-speaking peoples. Others feared communism more than fascism, and saw Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. When the War Cabinet met in late May 1940, they weren't discussing some fantasy scenario. They were weighing a concrete diplomatic option, facilitated through intermediaries, particularly through Mussolini's Italy, which hadn't yet entered the war. What would the peace terms have looked like? Based on diplomatic communications and historical records, Hitler's offer was essentially this. Britain keeps its independence and its empire. Germany dominates continental Europe. Britain stays out of European affairs. In exchange, Germany wouldn't invade the British Isles. On paper, it might have seemed reasonable. Britain would remain sovereign. The Royal Navy would still rule the waves. The empire from India to Africa to Canada would stay intact. British citizens wouldn't face occupation, bombing, or starvation. All Britain had to do was abandon Poland, whose independence they'd gone to war to defend, accept German control of Europe, and trust Adolf Hitler to keep his word. The question hanging over those cabinet meetings was simple, but agonizing. Was Churchill leading Britain to certain destruction by refusing a deal that might preserve everything that mattered? To understand why Churchill refused, you have to understand the man himself. Winston Churchill was 65 years old in 1940. He'd spent decades in politics, held nearly every major government position, and been spectacularly right and spectacularly wrong about different things. He'd warned about German rearmament throughout the 1930s when others called him an alarmist. He'd also championed disastrous military operations and made enemies across the political spectrum. But Churchill had something his colleagues lacked in that moment. He had an almost mystical sense of Britain's historical destiny. He believed deeply that Britain stood for something beyond mere survival. Democracy, liberty, parliamentary government. These weren't just political systems to him. They were sacred trusts. Churchill also understood Hitler in a way many of his contemporaries didn't. While others saw a German nationalist with legitimate grievances about the Treaty of Versailles, Churchill saw a revolutionary destroyer of civilized norms. He'd read Hitler's writings. He'd watched the persecution of Jews escalate. He'd seen how Hitler broke every agreement, absorbed Austria, dismembered Czechoslovakia, then invaded Poland, despite promises he wouldn't. Churchill knew that any peace with Hitler would be temporary. He believed that once Hitler controlled Europe, Britain would be next, regardless of any treaty. A strong Germany dominating the continent would eventually threaten British security. And a Nazi Germany would be exponentially worse. There was also something deeply personal in Churchill's defiance. He'd been politically isolated for years, dismissed as a warmonger and a has-been. Now, in Britain's darkest hour, he'd finally been given supreme responsibility. This was his moment, his vindication, and perhaps his doom. Churchill later wrote that if Britain went down fighting, at least history would say they'd gone down honorably. But if they surrendered and Hitler later turned on them anyway, history would record their capitulation as both cowardly and stupid. He was gambling with the survival of his country. But in his mind, surrender wasn't safety. It was just slower destruction. While Churchill was resolved to fight, he wasn't dictator. Britain was still a democracy, and the War Cabinet had to agree on major decisions. The cabinet included 5 key members. Churchill as Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, the previous Prime Minister who'd negotiated with Hitler at Munich, Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, Clement Attlee, and Arthur Greenwood from the Labour Party. The crucial figure was Lord Halifax. Halifax was Foreign Secretary, an experienced diplomat, and deeply skeptical of Churchill's approach. He argued that Britain should at least explore peace terms, not necessarily accept Hitler's offer, but see what could be negotiated through Mussolini as an intermediary. His reasoning was pragmatic. If France was about to fall and Britain's army was trapped, what exactly would Britain fight with? The Royal Navy was powerful but couldn't win a land war. The RAF was outnumbered. If Germany invaded, Britain might not be able to stop them. Halifax believed that negotiating from a position of weakness now was better than being conquered later. At least if you negotiated, you might preserve something. If you fought on and lost, you'd lose everything. The debates were intense. Chamberlain, surprisingly, backed Churchill. Despite his reputation as an appeaser, Chamberlain had learned his lesson about Hitler. He wouldn't support another betrayal of Britain's commitments. Attlee and Greenwood also supported Churchill, partly because they understood that Hitler's ideology was fundamentally opposed to everything the labor movement stood for. But Halifax wouldn't relent. On May 27th and 28th, as the Dunkirk evacuation hung in the balance, the War Cabinet met multiple times. The arguments grew heated. Halifax threatened to resign at one point, which would have brought down Churchill's government. Churchill faced an impossible situation. He needed cabinet unity, But he also knew that once you started negotiating with Hitler, the momentum toward surrender would become unstoppable. Once you accepted the premise that peace was possible, every military setback would strengthen the argument to accept it. So Churchill did something brilliant. He called a meeting of the full cabinet, all 25 ministers, not just the interwar cabinet. He spoke to them about Britain's destiny and the worthlessness of Hitler's promises. He asked them if they wanted to negotiate. They roared their support for fighting on. Churchill had outmaneuvered Halifax. He'd taken the decision beyond the small war cabinet to a larger group more likely to support defiance. Halifax couldn't resign now without looking like he was alone in wanting surrender. The decision was made. Britain would fight on. But there was another crucial factor in Churchill's thinking. America. The United States was neutral in May 1940. Roosevelt personally sympathized with Britain, but American public opinion was strongly isolationist. Most Americans wanted nothing to do with another European war. Churchill understood that Britain's only hope of ultimate victory was American entry into the war. But America wouldn't join if Britain surrendered. If Churchill negotiated peace with Hitler, that was it. Britain would be alone permanently. However, if Britain fought on heroically, if they showed courage and determination, American public opinion might shift. Churchill was gambling that British resistance would inspire American support, first with weapons and supplies, eventually with troops. This was a long shot. There was no guarantee America would ever fight. But Churchill knew that surrendering guaranteed defeat, while fighting at least kept the possibility of American intervention alive. Throughout the crisis, Churchill sent desperate messages to Roosevelt, begging for destroyers, aircraft, anything to help Britain survive. Roosevelt sent encouraging words, but little material help. American law prevented direct military aid to belligerents. Still, Churchill clung to hope. And he was right to. Britain's refusal to surrender, the heroism of Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain that summer, all of this gradually shifted American opinion. By 1941, America was providing massive aid through Lend-Lease. By December 1941, after Pearl Harbor, America was fully in the war. None of that happens if Britain accepts peace in May 1940. Let's imagine for a moment that Halifax had won the argument, that Britain had negotiated peace through Mussolini in June 1940. What would have happened? First, Germany would have dominated Europe completely and unopposed. France had already fallen. The Soviet Union was still Hitler's ally under the Nazi-Soviet Pact. No one would be fighting Germany. Hitler would have had years to consolidate his control, to fortify his conquests, to extract resources from occupied territories, to complete the Holocaust without interference. Some historians argue Hitler would have eventually attacked Britain anyway once his position was secure. The strategic logic that made Britain a threat wouldn't disappear just because of a treaty. Hitler broke every agreement when it suited him. Others think Hitler might have genuinely focused eastward, invading the Soviet Union even earlier than he did historically. In this scenario, Britain watches from the sidelines as Germany and Russia battle. Do they maintain neutrality? Do they end up forced to choose sides? The most chilling possibility is that Hitler wins in the East. Without Britain fighting in North Africa, in the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic, Germany could concentrate all its forces on Russia. The Soviet Union came terrifyingly close to defeat in our timeline. Without British resistance pulling German resources west, Stalin might have lost. Imagine Germany controlling Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. Imagine the Nazi regime with unlimited time, resources, and territory. Imagine no Allied invasion because there's no Britain to invade from. And what about America? Without British resistance, would America have ever entered the war at all? Pearl Harbor still might have brought war with Japan, but why would America fight Germany if Britain had already made peace? You might have ended up with a world split between three totalitarian empires: Nazi Germany in Europe, Imperial Japan in Asia, with America isolated in the Western Hemisphere, and the Soviet Union either conquered or exhausted. This wasn't paranoid speculation. This was the actual alternative if Churchill had chosen differently. While the cabinet debated, something extraordinary was happening on the beaches of France. The Dunkirk evacuation wasn't planned as a triumph. It was a desperate rescue mission. The British expected to save maybe 30,000 men before the pocket collapsed. They were preparing for the loss of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Then something incredible occurred. Hundreds of civilian vessels, fishing boats, pleasure craft, ferries, everything that could float, crossed the English Channel to help. The Royal Navy organized a massive flotilla. Bad weather temporarily grounded the Luftwaffe. And controversially, Hitler ordered his tanks to pause for 3 days. Over 9 days, from May 26th to June 4th, more than 300,000 British and French soldiers were evacuated. Not 30,000. Over 300,000. It was still a military defeat. Britain abandoned vast quantities of equipment, vehicles, artillery. The French were furious that Britain had evacuated its army while leaving France to collapse. But Britain had saved its trained soldiers. The core of a future army survived. Churchill famously told Parliament that wars are not won by evacuations, but he also recognized that Dunkirk provided hope exactly when it was needed most. Instead of Britain losing its army in a catastrophic encirclement, they'd pulled off an unexpected rescue. This changed the psychological calculation. If Britain had lost its entire army at Dunkirk, the pressure to negotiate would have been overwhelming. How do you defend an island with no army? But with those troops home, Britain could at least man the beaches. They could buy time. The miracle of Dunkirk made Churchill's decision to fight marginally less insane. Only marginally, though. Britain was still alone. France was finished. The only question was whether Britain would be next. The summer of 1940 was Britain's loneliest moment. France surrendered on June 22nd. Hitler staged the signing ceremony in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918. The symbolism was deliberate, humiliation, and revenge. Now Britain truly stood alone. German forces controlled the coastline from Norway to Spain. U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships bringing food and supplies to Britain. The Luftwaffe prepared for the bombing campaign that would become the Blitz. And German planners began work on Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. Hitler gave a speech offering peace one last time. He claimed he had no desire to destroy the British Empire. He still hoped Britain would see reason. Churchill's response was defiant silence. No negotiations, no discussions. Britain would fight. In retrospect, we know Britain survived. We know the RAF won the Battle of Britain. We know the invasion never came. We know America eventually joined the war and Germany was defeated. But in the summer of 1940, none of that was certain. Churchill later wrote that these were Britain's finest hours. But living through them must have been terrifying. Every night wondering if this was the night German paratroopers landed. Every morning checking if the invasion fleet had sailed. Ordinary British citizens prepared for occupation. Instructions were issued on how to resist. Plans were made to evacuate the government to Canada if London fell. The Home Guard trained with whatever weapons they could find, ready to fight German tanks with rifles and improvised bombs. This was the reality Churchill chose over peace. This constant fear. This ever-present possibility of annihilation. Why did the British people support him? Partly because Churchill articulated what many felt but couldn't express, that some things are worth fighting for even when victory seems impossible, that freedom has a value beyond mere survival, and partly because once you've decided to resist, you can't half commit. Once Britain rejected peace, they had no choice but to see it through. Surrender later would mean having endured all that suffering for nothing. Churchill understood this psychological dynamic. By refusing to negotiate, he'd committed Britain to a path from which there was no turning back. They had to win or go down fighting. Churchill's decision had consequences far beyond Britain. When Roosevelt watched Britain fight on alone, it strengthened his hand in pushing American support. Isolationists couldn't argue that Britain was weak or unworthy. Churchill's defiance gave Roosevelt the political cover to send destroyers, to push Lend-Lease through Congress, to prepare America for eventual war. When Stalin watched Britain survive the summer of 1940 and the Blitz that followed, he had to recalculate. Germany wasn't invincible. Resistance was possible, and when Hitler realized Britain wouldn't surrender, it forced him into strategic decisions that ultimately doomed Germany. He couldn't invade Russia while Britain remained hostile in the West. But he couldn't defeat Britain without achieving air superiority, which he failed to do. So he invaded Russia anyway in 1941 while still fighting Britain, creating the two-front war Germany couldn't win. Everything cascaded from that moment in May 1940. If Churchill had negotiated, World War II might have ended in Europe in 1940 with Nazi Germany triumphant. Instead, the war continued for 5 more brutal years, cost tens of millions more lives, but ended with Nazi Germany destroyed and democracy preserved. Was it worth it? That's a question we can ask because we know the outcome. We know the Allies won. We know democracy survived. We know the Holocaust was stopped, even though millions had already died. But Churchill didn't know any of that. He made his choice blind, gambling everything on an outcome he couldn't guarantee. So let's return to that room in May 1940. To Winston Churchill sitting with his cabinet, the map of Europe bleeding red with German conquests, the reports from Dunkirk growing more desperate by the hour. In that moment, choosing to fight required a kind of courage that's hard for us to fully comprehend. Not battlefield courage, though Churchill had shown that in his youth. This was different. This was the courage to accept responsibility for what might be Britain's annihilation. If Churchill had been wrong, if Britain had been conquered that summer, history would have judged him as the man who destroyed the British Empire through stubborn pride. Every death, every bombed city, every child killed in the Blitz would have been his fault. He chose to bear that weight, and in doing so, he kept alive the possibility that evil could be defeated, that tyranny could be resisted, that democracy, for all its flaws and weaknesses, was worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible. There's a lesson here that transcends history. Sometimes the rational choice, the safe choice, the choice that preserves what you have, is actually the path to losing everything. Sometimes courage means choosing uncertainty over guaranteed degradation. Sometimes you have to risk everything to preserve what matters most. Churchill didn't know he would win. He just knew he couldn't live with surrender. That decision, made in Britain's darkest moment, became the hinge of the 20th century. It kept democracy alive when it might have been extinguished. It gave resistance fighters across occupied Europe hope that liberation might come. It showed that determination and courage could matter more than raw military power. None of the freedom we enjoy today was guaranteed. It was fought for, bled for, defended by people like Churchill who refused to surrender when surrender seemed rational. The next time you face an impossible choice, remember that smoke-filled room in May 1940. Remember a stubborn old man who said no when everyone told him to accept reality. Remember that sometimes the only way to win is to refuse to lose. Churchill saved Britain by refusing peace. And in saving Britain, he saved the world. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button. History isn't just dates and battles. It's people making impossible choices that echo through time. And there are so many more stories like this one waiting to be told. See you in the next video.